But I think this will have to come. I think actually whoever wins the election, it will come in the end, because how else are you going to create a much bigger trained reserve for the armed forces in what is going to be undoubtedly a much more dangerous world in the next 5 to 10 years than we've experienced since the end of the Cold War.
William, this is our first time speaking with you since the campaign has kicked off. Did you know a snap election was coming?
Well, I would have been surprised if it had been in the autumn, actually, knowing Rishi Sunak well. So I wasn't surprised that there was an election, because I think he wanted to get on with it. He doesn't like the instability of a long lead up to the general election for the country, or necessarily for the Conservative Party, of course. All party leaders think of it in those terms as well. So I wasn't surprised that there was an early election, no.
Who's had the better start, in your opinion, William? I mean, it's been a rocky couple of days for the Tories so far, hasn't it?
Well, they've had the most substantive start. I mean, obviously they're my party, so I'm biased, but what you see in terms of actual new substantial policy proposals, they're predominantly coming from the Conservative side. That will be, when you think of it objectively, that's because they know they've got ground to make up. They're so far behind in opinion polls. The Labour Party isn't doing that. The Labour Party is Keir Starmer's making speeches and so on, but nothing new in those speeches. So I think that's the notable thing of the first week. The big national service announcement, which is something I strongly support from the Conservatives, which has really been the biggest development in terms of actual policy, something to really get your teeth into and argue about. That's come from the Conservative side. Maybe Labour will have some equivalents coming along, but they haven't done it so far.
I want to come back to that national service proposal in just a minute. But Kezia, I mean, how do you think it's going so far for Labour? I mean, some people have suggested that Keir Starmer is being a little bit too cautious and they would like to see him do something a bit more exciting. Is he wise to try and stay the course for the longer term?
I think he's playing a blinder. This is a 6-week campaign where he really has to concentrate everything he had hoped to do over a broader 5 or 6 months period, in the hope that he was planning for an autumn election. So steady as she goes is the way. That's what any party would do if it was sitting on a 25-point lead. And you can see that through the professionalism of all the events, the campaign launches and speeches that the Labour Party have had so far. It's textbook. It's almost flawless in that regard. There might be a couple of moments yet. I would like to see a couple more significant policies, but it's still relatively early in the 5 weeks that we have to go.
I mean, is it going to be enough, though, in terms of momentum for Labour? Because you're right, they are ahead in the polls, but there is some suggestion that maybe people are just anti-Tory and less very pro-Labour, if that makes sense. So do you think it's going to be enough, that cautious approach?
I actually think it is enough. My big fear about an autumn election was going to be turnout, in the sense that, certainly in Scotland anyway, people coming home at 5 o'clock at night in late October, early November, and it's dark and it's wet and it's raining, might have wondered, why should I bother go out and vote? As if they weren't sure there was enough of a difference. That factor's disappeared now with a July election, and you can see in the faces of Labour activists and candidates, they are really up for this. They are so excited, and there's a lot of energy around the campaign, which I think will drive that turnout across the constituencies of the country. So it's been a pretty flawless start from Labour so far, and long may that continue.
And William, you mentioned the national service proposal. I think it's fair to say it has divided opinion. We spoke to a young Conservative who actually has left the party because of it this morning. He says it's not a coherent policy. It's not something that the party's thought through, and he believes it will see the Tories out of power for a generation. I mean, it was a bold move. It was something very different that we didn't expect. But do you think it has the potential to backfire?
Well, people will. Some people will be in favour of it, and others against it, like the one you quoted. That's the thing about producing an actual proposal rather than a few things on a pledge card that that nobody can really disagree with. And I think it's good in an election when you have something that you can actually argue about. It is a coherent proposal. I mean, this is what is done in Norway and Sweden, and is done very successfully, both from the point of view of having a bigger trained reserve for the armed forces and having young people from all over their countries brought together and spending time together with a purposeful activity. So I think there are major social benefits as well as military benefits to it. And, yeah, people will be divided. Look at the letters page of our paper today, of the Times, and there's different views, but a lot of support for it. So I'm totally, I think this will have to come. I think actually whoever wins the election, it will come in the end, because how else are you going to create a much bigger trained reserve for the armed forces in what is going to be undoubtedly a much more dangerous world in the next 5 to 10 years than we've experienced since the end of the Cold War.
William, before we move on to talk about Labour's plans for business, Lee would like me to ask you very specifically, did Rishi Sunak tell you that there was a snap election coming? You've told us you expected it not to be in November, that you thought he would go ahead of time. Did you know officially about it before we all did?
No, as I say, I would have been surprised if it hadn't been an earlier election, but that's the only impression that I had. And any conversations I have with the Prime Minister or any other party leader are going to have to stay confidential. But that's all. I would have been surprised if it had been a later election.
Let's move on to that story that's on the front page of the Times today. City figures back Labour with call for new outlook. This is 120 business leaders signing a letter to the Times saying that they back what Labour's plans are. Kezia, do you think that this actually has much of an effect? Do you think that this pushes any voters in a direction they might not otherwise have been thinking about?
I think it's less about changing voters' intentions and more about mood music. So this is a really important development for the Labour Party, who had to do an awful lot of work off the back of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership to reassure the business community that they were not a threat to business, that they believed in capitalism, they believed in economic growth, they just wanted to share the benefits of that growth across the country. So to have 120 business leaders sign the letter, I think is significant, particularly when you look at some of the names on that list. Ian Anderson is all over Twitter today, declaring himself as a Conservative voter and supporter for the best part of 40 years. Not only is he going to be voting Labour in this election, but he's actually done some of the groundwork behind the scenes with Rachel Reeves on the offer to business. And it's not just Conservatives that are switching to Labour. There are some soft SNP supporters actually who have moved across as well. A significant one in that list is also Benny Higgins, the founder of Tesco Bank, who has done a lot with the SNP government over the recent years, including setting up the Scottish National Investment Bank, who's now said in the papers today that the only future for the country is with Labour as well. So that mood music, that momentum, that reassurance of the business community staying to the business community, Labour's on your side, I think is really important.
And William Hague, this is normally a Tory tactic, isn't it? What does it say that actually the Tories can't cobble one together, it seems, this time around?
Well, I think what you'll see in terms of the tactics of the election is that this is Labour getting their retaliation in first. Perfectly good move on their part to show that there are those business people that Kezia was talking about who support them, because you can probably easily assemble as big a list or longer list or higher ranking list of people who would say, well, we don't want a Labour government from the business community, and probably that sort of thing will happen over the next few weeks. So they're getting this in first to show that they've got some supporters in that world. And Labour are, of course, the polling favourites to win the election, as we've said. And if they are indeed elected, it will be really important that they can work well with the business world. And then some of the things that are said in that letter, where the business leaders say, we want a government with fiscal discipline and a long-term growth strategy. Well, that's a good thing to want. Whether they will get that from a Labour government remains to be seen. So that, of course, would be the test, whether you really think those things will happen in a Labour government. But yeah, in electoral terms, it's getting this in before the Conservatives produce a long list of business people.
Okay, but Kezia, it's interesting that we spoke to two of the people who signed the letter. One person who runs Resi, the sort of residential architecture firm, and then also the founder of Wikipedia as well. And they were both obviously fully behind what was in the letter. We're clearly supporting Labour at this general election, but both of them made clear that they would want to see more details from Labour before polling day. Is that fair?
Of course it's fair, and I think that's a criticism that can be applied to many of the policy announcements that Labour have put forward so far. But equally, that's a smart thing for Labour to do, not to show its hand entirely at this point in an election, just to signal the direction of travel. That's what Sir Keir Starmer's been actually saying for months, if not years now, by focusing all of his policies behind these ideas of missions for the country. He's been very clear about that, very consistent about that for a long time. And the detail, I think, will be developed from office, because it's only then, actually, in fairness, that Labour will be able to fully get to grips with the state of the economy, the state of the business that needs to be done in government. And I think you'll see from Keir Starmer every attempt to level with people about the situation he finds himself in.
And yet both, William, you mentioned, how the letter calls for fiscal responsibility. We were talking about this earlier on with the person who would be Labour's business secretary if they get into office, that, the IFS points out that both of them are guilty of a silence over the broader economic picture of what departmental spending will be in a few years' time. The IFS saying that neither side have really laid out plans to suggest what they might do to avoid deep cuts. That's quite a silence from both sides, isn't it, William?
Yeah, well, whoever wins the election will almost certainly have to have a comprehensive spending review to decide what the spending priorities are for the next few years. I think, yeah, that will be a challenge for both parties, because there is this long-term growth issue that I was mentioning in relation to the business leaders. Of where do you get the productivity and the growth in the British economy? Now, in my view, this is where I've been doing some cross-party things in the last 18 months with the papers I've done with Tony Blair, pointing out that it's actually only through science, technology, innovation, being at the forefront of artificial intelligence, that we can do that. So whoever wins is going to have to go big in that direction. And I hope if Labour win, they will go big in that direction. And that's the sort of thing we could do with hearing more about in the election campaign, rather than the traditional political issues. The world is changing very, very rapidly now in terms of science and technology. And both parties need to set out how exactly they are going to make the most of that rather than fall behind.
Yeah, and that's all right for the medium term, though, isn't it, Kezia? But I guess in the short term, in terms of the next 1, 2, 3 years, there will have to be something in terms of either higher taxes or cuts in department before you get the benefit of any growth that might or might not come. And there's no clarity on that, really, is there?
No, and I think we both know, or we all know, it's going to be incredibly difficult first couple of years because of the state of the public finances. I actually think Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have been pretty honest about that, and they use that as the reason why they've had to deny every challenge to their policy platform for not being bold enough or more radical enough. I've talked on this programme before about my desperate desire to see Labour to commit itself to scrapping the two-child cap, for example, and Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves' response to that is, we just don't have the cash. Now, that's a realistic, fair, honest answer with the country. I might not like it, but that is the truth. The other thing we need to recognise, though, is the demographic challenges facing the country as well. So if everything stood still, significant cuts would have to come. But the degree to which we're developing an ageing population and a reduced working population offers up some really deep structural problems that the next government is going to have to face for future years, whether it wants to or not.
William, can I ask you about this idea that both parties are currently trying to account for their spending on some of these policy pledges from tax evasion and avoidance? Now, both Labour and the Tories have done this. Labour have suggested it would be spent on the NHS and schools, and the Tories today are suggesting that it would be part of the way they would fund their offer to pensioners. How comfortable are you with using that stream of funding, given that it is not secure? And Paul Johnson from the IFS said there is no real way of knowing how much you'd be able to claw back and how quickly.
Well, both parties can use it a bit, I think, is the honest answer. But they can't, if in another 2 weeks' time, every single thing that they announce is going to be paid for that way on either side, that's when you get really suspicious about it. But yeah, to say that in any given year there can be new method, new stepping up in tax enforcement, and it produces a few £billion, well, that actually is in line with what has happened in many years past. So it's realistic to say that a little bit. But both parties have probably spent most of that money now. So it's the time to look out for this is in the middle of the election campaign, if they are still announcing new things and saying that. But a little bit is realistic enough, I think.
And Kezia, what's your view on that?
I think that's right. It's certainly not the case that you'd want to hinge a whole party political manifesto on the gains you can get from closing those loopholes, but you can attempt to spend a little bit of it. And once you see the receipts from that particular effort in future years, you can work out how much you need to adjust going forth. It's just one of a number of different ways that Labour and the Conservatives are going to have to point to new money for new policies. It's standard run-of-the-mill stuff for an election campaign. The good news is we only have 5 weeks of it, so we shouldn't have too much of it.
Just 5 weeks. You must be the only person saying it. Oh, it's just 5 weeks.
Could have been 5 months, Luke. It could have been 5 months.
God help us. Right, more from both of you in a minute, Kezia and William. We'll hear more a little bit later on today from Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor. Her speech is scheduled for just after 10 a.m. in Derbyshire, so Patrick Maguire will have full coverage of that. Coming up, we will discuss the potentially widening generational divide with one Tory policy idea today, and also the role that Reform UK could play in this election as well. It is 9:20. This is Times Radio Breakfast with Kate McCann and Luke Jones in association with Nationwide, a good way to bank.
Global events.
We've been calling for the government to come to the table.
Breaking news.
Britain will support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Reactive analysis.
This will continue to cause problems.
From the world's best journalists.
I think the worst economic time we've had in well over a century.
Keeping you informed as events unfold.
The government is digging in on its argument.
On DAB, online, on the app and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Hey business owners, need help taking payments online? Well, there's a whole world of transactions powered by Elevon. Whether it's through payment accepting, customer connecting, real-time reporting, round-the-clock supporting, fraud detecting or business protecting. Elevon supports all payments for your business. To get started, visit elevon.co.uk. Elevon, your world of payments.
Find the sun in the southern skies here in New Zealand. It lights up our islands from north to south and everywhere in between. From the golden landscapes to the breeze that fills sails. Whether you're on the go or letting go, warmth is in every welcome and around every corner. So if you seek the sun and then some, you'll find it all here in New Zealand.
Times Radio Breakfast with Nationwide. Whenever you need to, you can always contact a real person on the Nationwide banking app.
9:21. Luke Jones and Kate McCann here on Times Radio for you. With William Hague and Kezia Dugdale join us to talk through some of the biggest stories of the day. And we've had two big policies from the Tories this week, National Service and a tax cut for pensioners. Some people have put those two things together and suggested that it's no surprise the Tories are going after the so-called grey vote, but asking what about the next generation? That pensions promise, £100 tax cut, will be paid for, as we've just been talking about, by a clampdown on tax evasion. William, I mean, how sensible do you think it is for the Tories to pursue what looks like, and what, Harry Cole, the editor of The Sun, political editor of The Sun, was telling us earlier, looks like pursuing a sort of a grey vote? Is that a wise move from Rishi Sunak?
Well, that depends on the full context, of course. That's today's announcement from the Conservatives about about taxes for pensioners. But remember, what they've actually been doing the last 6 months is reducing taxes on working people in the national insurance contributions, which have been reduced by 4% in total. Now, that doesn't go to pensioners because they don't pay national insurance contributions. So that's for people of all ages who are working, including young people who are working. So you can see it in that context that there's been a much bigger tax cut implemented by the Conservatives recently for people who are not pensioners. Therefore, now they're producing a proposal that is for pensioners as well. So I think that's the context. It will be very important for both parties in the election to talk about the needs of younger people, and that particularly when it comes to housing, of course, which I'm sure is going to be a big issue in the election, particularly about the future of work, and in particular about issues like mental health, which has become a major problem among adolescent people. So I hope all those are going to be addressed. As Kezia says, there's 5 weeks to go in this campaign yet.
Yeah, and Kezia, that is something that lots of our listeners have been getting in touch with us about today, largely saying that even if they are pensioners or even if they are Conservative supporters, they don't feel that this is the right way to spend money. They would like to see it spent on house building or even actually social care. Do you think that this strategy risks alienating some voters?
Of course. And I think what's often misunderstood when we talk about the policies you need to appeal to the grey vote, to people over the age of 65, is that they're only going to vote in their own interest. Where my experience of campaigning, knocking on doors the length and breadth of the country, speaking to older people, is the thing that motivates them is what life is like for their kids or their grandkids. So that's why I often think it's misplaced when we talk about what motivates the grey vote and only talk about their pensions or their economic security than the future of their kids. And what's particularly interesting about this election is the polling as it breaks down across age groups, because yes, it's the case that the Conservatives are still ahead with over 65 age group, but only just. I mean, the current polling that I'm looking at just now shows the Tories on 33% and Labour on 32%. So there's a lot in this for Labour as well, which is why I think you'll see Keir Starmer speak about that sort of intergenerational aspiration and wanting better for your kids than you had yourself. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, however, just 7% of 18 to 24-year-olds are set to vote Conservative. No wonder the Conservatives can offer up a policy like National Service, knowing it's not really young people that are going to be voting for it.
Well, William, was that National Service policy designed to appeal to young people?
Well, I think it ought to appeal to young people because where countries do have, as I was talking earlier about the Scandinavian countries, similar schemes, they're very popular with young people who actually do then compete to get some of the places involved and regarded as a part of their accreditation in their early careers. And it's very popular that they've been able to mix with other people from other parts of the country as well. So I think it's the right thing to promote, whether or not it's actually instantly popular. It is the right thing for the country, and that is what an election is meant to be about.
Let's move on to the role that Reform UK could play in this election. We heard from Nigel Farage a little bit earlier on, the honorary president. He's appearing at their launch in Dover, where, as he was telling us, they're focusing on immigration.
The main reason this general election has been called is Sunak's promise that the boats would go in July. He knew those boats would not go in July because the European Court of Human Rights won't allow it. And I think that's the proper debate that we need to have. We cannot control our borders fully over issues like the small boats, all the while this court in Strasbourg has jurisdiction over us. And I just want people, and it may well be British people say, well, look, we'll have to live with it because we want to be part of this court. But we can't do both.
Is that your answer? Is your answer then just to leave that court? Is that your solution to the problem?
Well, we will not be able to deport people in the way that we used to. I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, the last Labour government, by 2010, they were deporting up to 45,000 people a year who came to Britain illegally. Since then, that court has given itself more and more power. Yes, it's part of the answer.
That's Nigel Farage speaking to us a little bit earlier on. It's hard to say what issues will dominate or motivate voters when it comes to it. But William, do you think immigration is that a big issue? Is that something that the Conservatives in particular should be focusing on?
Well, that's bound to be an issue, and all the party leaders will be asked all the time through the election campaign what they're going to do about immigration. I think the point about Nigel Farage and reform is that if people will have to think carefully about whether their vote will get them the opposite of what they intend. If there are people who think the country will have a harder line on immigration if they vote for reform, well, actually, probably the most likely effect of their vote would be they'd end up with a Labour government that would have a softer line on immigration overall. So I think that people will have to focus on that come election day. Reform is an important factor in this election because they're getting over 10% in opinion polls. And in the local elections where they had candidates, the Conservatives were more likely to lose than where they didn't have candidates.
I wonder how weak a flank it is, you think, for Rishi Sunak, because it's not just some Conservative voters thinking, we might back reform. There's a Conservative MP, the latest one, Lucy Allen, who's stepping down as Telford's MP at the election, said she's backing Reform's candidate in that constituency. So you've even got some of his own MPs supporting reform.
Yeah, well, there's a good case in point because Telford is a seat that can be won by either side, Conservative or Labour. It won't be won by Reform. So if she and Conservative voters vote for Reform, they'll end up with a Labour MP. So in a general election with our voting system, that is a very self-defeating thing to do. And people can wish there was a different voting system, but it is the voting system, and they will end up with a Labour government with an even bigger majority than some polls say if they vote for Reform.
Kezia, what do you think about what Reform's influence could be? Because, of course, it's not just Conservative voters they're hoping to nab, it's also Labour ones.
Well, first of all, it's high time we did change the electoral voting system in this country, and I really hope that that's something that will come in the not too distant future. Look, if there was one decent justification for calling that general election early, it was to catch Reform on the hop. And it was almost palpable in Scotland, the sigh of relief you could hear from Westminster and the Conservative Party that Nigel Farage wasn't standing as a candidate and that he would have a less prominent place in the campaign. Now, he's obviously front and centre today and in his usual divisive, controversial self. And I'm just very grateful that we won't have a terribly large amount of that in the coming weeks, because I don't think it contributes much to the very difficult conversations we need to have as a country about these fine lines and these issues.